Hi there. This is Emmett the God Singer. Another episode from One Walk 1000 Testimonies. These are personal testimonies that I have experienced as my 57 years as a Christian. I grew up in LA, some good parts of LA, some bad parts of LA. Spent most of it in the foothills of the San Fernando Valley, just north of LA. And I learned a lot of stuff there. Today we're going to talk about the couple of the spiritual gifts. Okay. Now, I believe in the spiritual gifts. I have problems with people that don't believe in the spiritual gifts since they are biblical. And they always seem to cite the verse that says, if there are spiritual gifts, they will cease. But in that same verse, it says, if there is knowledge, it will cease. And the quest for knowledge has never really ceased yet. So I believe knowledge will cease when we all get to heaven and we will be all knowing. All questions will be answered. Until then, as long as there is a search for knowledge, then the gifts will be there as well. It's the same verse. It's the same sentence. So, that being said, I have witnessed, today we're going to talk about tongues, the gift of tongues. Now, I do not speak in tongues. I do not have the gift of speaking in tongues. I never have. I don't believe that everybody should speak in tongues. They say, and I've been to a lot of churches that said, if you're not filled with the Spirit, if you don't speak in tongues, well, you know what? The tongues is one of the gifts, and not everybody has it. Okay? Some of my gifts include knowledge, discernment, and interpretation of tongues. Now, I've been in churches for years and years where I will interpret tongues, and I can tell. I mean, it's interesting when, somebody speaks in tongues when the time is right, and, you hear them and everybody's quiet, and first off, I know if they're really speaking in tongues or if they're trying to edify themselves. I've gotten to know a lot of pastors where someone would speak in tongues and the pastor would look at me, knowing me, and I would either like this, or I would, just so nobody can see. And if I went like this, he knew, because of my gift of discernment, I know if those tongues were real or not, and if I, gave him the nod, he would wait for an interpretation. If I went like this, he would give an interpretation, from Scripture, and then he would approach that person privately later on and let him know that, you're not really speaking in tongues, you're just edifying yourself, and you need to stop that in a nice way, of course. And I never really actually spoke up the interpretation. What I used to do, and the way I got the job, nodding yes or no, was I was writing down, as they were speaking in tongues, the interpretation. God would give it to me, and I would write it down as quick as I could and hold on to it. Okay? And then somebody would give the interpretation, and I would look at the paper, and 99% of the time, it was the same message. I mean, the words are a little different, like one time somebody, said, my spirit covers the earth and I own everything in it. And my interpretation was the mantle of my robe covers the entire earth and the earth is mine. So, the same kind of thing, And I've done this, and I've showed it to my wife. I started, when phones came out, I started talking on them, saying it quietly on the phone. So it was time stamped, and I would hand it to the pastor afterwards and show him. And he was always, it was further evidence that, this is real. And sometimes no interpretation is needed. I remember once in 1984, 84, Valencia, California. I had been the worship leader there for some time. And we had a kid was coming there. He was, 15, I think. And barely spoke the language. Her parents had just immigrated from some little country that nobody had heard of. I mean, it's not even one of the ones they talk about now. It was some little tiny backward, had their own dialect. They had their own language. And he was coming to the youth group, and he would come to church on Sundays and Sunday evenings. And one day his parents came because they were worried about their son. They wanted to make sure he wasn't getting in trouble. They wasn't making sure he wasn't, following, some, bad stuff. So they came to an evening service, and they did not speak any English at all. They didn't speak the language. And the son was getting better. They had been here about 6 months, and he was getting better at it. And he had made a lot of friends, because, youth groups are great. I was in them. So they were sitting in the service, and towards the back, just they couldn't understand anything, but they were watching people praising and singing. And there's always a quiet time after the worship. There's prayer, and this is when tongues were speaking. Well, there was this 13-year-old girl that was sitting up in like the third row, had never spoken in tongues. She stood up and started speaking in tongues, what we thought were speaking in tongues. And she finished and sat down. And then you could hear crying in the back. So he turned around, and it was this couple. It was these parents of this boy that had been going to our youth group that had just emigrated from another country, the right way. They didn't come through the border or anything like that. But this was back in '84, and the son, was, his eyes were open too, and he brought his parents forward up to the front. And they came up. Dad was just like a zombie, and Mom had been crying. And he brought him to the front, and they turned around, and the boy goes, "These are my parents." Nobody had really seen him come in, although we knew who they were. And he proceeded to talk. They didn't know the language. He said, "My parents thought I was getting into trouble here, and that I was doing bad things. But this girl," and they knew this 13-year-old girl, she had never spoken in tongues. She knew nothing about the country or the language. He said, until she spoke, and she said, "This is a message from God to you." It says, "I am here. I am with your son. He will grow here. He will prosper here, and so will you. Have no fear." And she wanted to assure them, and this was the interpretation of the tongues. And the mom said, it was whispered to the son's ear, and he said, "Oh yeah, she spoke in our language, in our dialect. She had the same accents that we have on our words. She sounded like she was from our village." And everybody was just blown away. I mean, they started, clapping, and then everybody got up and prayed for them and hugged the parents. And it was a great thing. But, tongues like that, and, that was how the original apostles were speaking other languages. And if you don't understand it, it sounds like gibberish to you. And I've heard this more than once. This is one of my favorite ones that comes to my mind. But, you know, tongues are there, and tongues edify. Sometimes they speak to one person, sometimes they speak to a whole congregation. It's important to surround the stuff in your church and to nurse the talents of people that can speak in tongues and that can interpret in tongues. Because it says if there's not an interpreter, if it doesn't edify the body, it's just gibberish. And sometimes it is gibberish. And sometimes it's not. Oftentimes there'll be a pastor there that can say something that will edify the body without embarrassing the person. Just saying, up, you're fake, get out of here, I believe you should talk to those people and say, you're not, even if you think you're speaking in tongues, you're not. If that's your prayer language, you need to do that at home in private, I have a problem with pastors that will use their prayer language in the pulpit when the Bible clearly says not to do that. It says to use that in your prayer closet. So it starts praying and they just started saying gobbledygook, and people are sitting there and people are uncomfortable because you're not edifying people. If you're going to speak out loud in the church, it needs to edify God. It needs to edify the body. If you're not edifying the God of the body, if you're just edifying yourself, God doesn't want to hear it. And neither does anybody else. But sometimes, like this one instance, tongues can be a good thing. Knowledge is a good thing. Discernment is a good thing. You should, and there's plenty of tests out there, to let you know what kind of the spiritual gifts that, that God sends you. Because he gives everybody a talent. God gives everybody a talent. He can use everybody. And he has a specific purpose for your life. I found out mine is discernment. Mine is obviously music. I've been a musician, singing for God since I was 7, and I'm 62 now. So, and sometimes I think that I wasted my life trying to be a musician, but God has assured me that not a minute of it was wasted. There's a whole other ministry where I went from church to church to church, and I was the worship leader until I reached one person that would change the world for that church. And then God had me move on. And we'll start talking about that here pretty soon too. But that's today's. Just a small sample of what tongues can and can't do. But there'll be more later. Love God. Keep your coffee warm.